G'day, and welcome to the AHDC podcast series, Health Design on the Go. I'm your host, David Cummins, and today we are speaking to Associate Professor Aidan Rowe, Professor of Design Studies at the University of Alberta in Canada. Beginning with a Bachelor of Fine Arts, Aidan continued his studies into the world of design thinking and continued to explore the benefits of design research across the globe, obtaining multiple degrees and teaching in the UK at the University for the Creative Arts in London. Aidan has been working in Alberta for over 15 years, and he's continued with design thinking in the world of health, which is why he's such an important guest today for our design thinking and consultant research series. Welcome, Aidan. Thank you for your time to be here.
Thank you for the invite, David.
So that's a lot of degrees. How many degrees do you have to become an associate professor?
Most people would have at least 3 degrees. That's what I have, as well as a certificate in higher education teaching. But most people would have 3 degrees.
And they're predominantly based around design thinking and art, correct?
Yeah. So my background is coming from the design side of things. My original degree was what we call visual communication design here, and that might be called graphic design in other types of institutions. And then after that, 2 research degrees that broadened that out, but always situated within design and always situated kind of within a human-centered approach.
And for those who aren't 100% familiar in design thinking, can you just briefly explain what design thinking is and how it can benefit pretty much any problem in the world?
That's a big ask, Dave. Design, and this changes and works from it. It's after somebody named Herbert Simon, is the idea of understanding our situation as it is now and seeing a change, seeing some improvement within there, and then figuring out how to get there. How do we get from here to there? So that might be really small. That could be a very small, very focused sort of problem or issue to sort of address. But as we know as well, that might be really massive. What's often called a wicked problem. How do we apply design to that in the human-centered approach is broadly what my research looks at.
Design thinking's been around in Australia for a little bit, but certainly not as long as Canada, it seems. And we were always taught with design thinking, 90% problem, 10% solution. And I still find today, especially those that have not actually undertaken design thinking training, they always try to go to solution mode, thinking what their experience or their ego or their peers might think is the best solution. But if you actually do take that extra time to understand the problem and have empathy and non-judgment and really do the research, the outcomes are generally pretty phenomenal. What do you think about the idea of a solution-based answer as opposed to a design thinking understanding of the problem?
I was just working on a paper that speaks kind of exactly to that. You hit numerous really big things there. Historically, we think of design, and even designers do, there's a really nice, attractive things that are impressive in some sort of way, whether that's graphic design, furniture design, fashion design, all these sorts of areas. And as you said, this idea of actually the investment in understanding the problem or the situation to actually sort of form how it moves forward. And even with my students, there's often the use of the word solution. And I think even that's a problematic word in the fact that if anything, there's maybe solutions, a variety of these things. But we also know, generally standing back, that, anything that we're going to put forth as a design response to something, but Lord knows it seems a lot of things that we create to solve something create many more problems or many more issues through there. But I think that idea, as you said, that full weighting upon understanding the problem, and that understanding often really also only comes through conversation with people and working with the actual sort of people who are involved in here. One of the things that often happens in design is that you're an outsider. You've been asked to help resolve something, and often you are most likely maybe not the client or the user of that. And so how do I understand that? And that's this kind of often what I would call a participatory design approach of, okay, let me try and really kind of understand this. How does one as a designer check one's ego, check a rush to a solution? There's an idea of the designer as a facilitator of something rather than necessarily a solver of problems. It does raise many questions within there about these ideas of preparation, about research, but that investment at the beginning really pays off at the end. And one of the things that I think is actually really interesting is that often design thinking or ideas around design thinking may be often more successfully grasped and utilized by non-designers. And that's one of the really powerful parts of it, is that actually, how could we have this kind of process that's open and a means of working that really opens it up. And again, that's a bit of an ego issue of I've spent a lot of time working as a designer, being educated as a designer, teaching as a designer. And there's something really contradictory about spending all that time and then also sort of advocating that anybody could be a designer if you actually sort of take this approach. And so I think there's always a lot of unpacking and unpicking of like, what does it mean to be a designer? What are we doing? How do we shift that idea of what I often talk about is rather, there's a real focus on the kind of outputs of design, the things we make versus the outcomes, like what has actually changed, what happens, how do we measure success within something, which is part of, as you said, that process, right? If we don't know how we're going to measure success while we're actually developing this, what's the change, which is going to be good? How do we get to the end where we can actually say, wow, yeah, that did improve things or didn't, or some of these things may work much better than thought. But yeah, an attempt to check that ego, an attempt to invest in the process, an attempt to trust people and sort of work through there is integral.
Yeah, 100% agree. So you're talking earlier about a wicked problem, and I imagine most countries in the world would consider, especially more recently with COVID and the aging population, healthcare a wicked problem where there is often multiple factors at play, all big factors in themselves when it comes to one big group, which is certainly some of the problems we have in healthcare in Australia, and I assume similar in Canada. Your research recently has been more focusing on healthcare as a design wicked problem, and especially taking on board those considerations of the aging population and chronic disease and things like that. Do you mind just telling those people that haven't read your research about your more recent research into healthcare and how design thinking has helped?
Yeah, there's probably a few strands of the research that, again, working with many different sorts of people. Some of the recent work that I'm doing right now with two colleagues involves looking at health education itself. So how doctors, let's say, are trained in medical school. So I've done work with them on how you might apply design in that space. How might there be a design thinking process, and how might this, as a provider of healthcare, how might that allow us to reframe how we think healthcare works, how we might respond to there. So I teach in a variety of different contexts within there in healthcare. So that's one sort of direct way. A paper published this week starts to look at the environment, what we call the emergency room or the A&E in, let's say, England, how the design of that space itself may facilitate and or hinder healthcare processes, and trying to look very broadly at those healthcare processes as well. We often really think of the healthcare process, let's say in the emergency room, really only be I'm a patient and I need help. But there's a lot of interrelationships there as well. If we think of hierarchies of medical staff, if we think of the people who are sick or needing attention, but they're also usually brought in by family members. What does care look like before going to an emergency room? What does it look like after? So a recent paper that will be published right away with a colleague, Michelle Knox, it's a systematic review of looking at other people's research to better understand how might the design of the physical environment and the processes and systems involved in there actually affect our healthcare outcomes through there. So those are two broad areas, sort of like the idea of environments and systems and the idea of education as well as a means of addressing some of these complex, wicked problems.
And you said that research is about to come out, correct? Because I haven't seen.
Yeah, it was just accepted this weekend. So that's.
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah, so that'll be a paper that's in a journal called Herd, and that should be coming out right away. And that's, as I said, it's a systematic review on existing work around the emergency department and the relationship with design. So hopefully that's out right away.
Yeah, perfect. I look forward to that. So what were your findings necessarily with that one? Because the ED in itself, that's even more complex than the actual health system itself, depending on the ED.
It's actually really difficult to think of a more complex environment. We're sort of looking at it, the kind of most challenging place. When I describe that environment to everyone, first off, it's an environment that almost all of us will encounter at some point. Unfortunately, no matter what, whether you are as a patient or whether you are helping somebody through that sort of process, it's pervasive in that first instance. Everybody will encounter it. Maybe another large factor from it is that there isn't a lot of published research in this area already. It's an area that has either been neglected or hasn't necessarily been considered. Usually design is really almost only considered at two very specific moments, especially within kind of the built environment there. Either the initial idea of like, we're going to build this hospital, and then after that, very small, minute design considerations. It was really interesting in the fact that there actually wasn't a lot of research. And again, we're looking at English language, we're looking at publicly accessible documents, these sorts of things. But we really only looked at just over 30 articles that we were able to track that really looked at emergency departments or emergency rooms and design in these sorts of ways. But these identified issues around overcrowding, wait times, privacy and communication, the things you would expect in many sorts of ways. It did uncover, though, as well, one of the things that we do see a lot happening is that the emergency department is also treating a lot of people that probably shouldn't or don't need to be there. Partly they're there because of limitations on the existing systems. I can't speak for Australia, but in Canada, I don't have a doctor right now because it's very difficult to find a doctor. Through there, fortunately, I'm healthy and youngish enough, but that's a very common issue. And if you don't have a doctor, if you don't have regular medical advice within there, and if you also maybe do not have the resources that many people do have, whether financial or access to information or the ability to understand that information, the emergency department becomes a port of call often through there, which then obviously makes it a much more challenging sort of space. And as you talked about, COVID, aging populations, there's a variety of really, really challenging situations.
Yeah, I look forward to reading that. Yeah, other research, I'm pretty sure it came out about 2020, so I wasn't too sure if it included COVID or not, but it was all about rethinking health through design, about medication, aging population, and actually the healthcare system as a whole. For those of you that haven't read that research, do you mind just talking about that research piece in itself? And then the lead into that question is about more COVID. So I assume at that point in time, COVID wasn't really an issue for that research.
Well, it was before that, which is an interesting point to think about it, as you say, where that's obviously shifted almost anything that we would think about there. That was a co-authored piece with my colleagues Gillian Harvey and Michelle Knox. And that was a piece where health design has been a focus of this design studies department at this university for decades. But this was a piece where three of us came together with sort of three different streams of research that explored the intersections of design and health, and wanted to write about that almost both to give it some context, but also to give some case studies examples and to try and situate it, creating an article that was hopefully of interest and valuable to both the design side and on the healthcare side. So there's three streams within there. The first stream is some of the work that I've done around education, which I talked about a little earlier. So I documented some work on, in this instance, was offering a summer term course, so in between the normal semesters at our university, that brought together design students and healthcare students. So students studying for medicine, physiotherapy, nursing, and they worked in teams together with design students to tackle health design issues, usually at the social and community sorts of levels. My colleague Gillian Harvey does a lot of work around information design and work around urgent care design. And so she does a lot of work around information design around urgent situations. The specific information in there is around her work around naloxone for people who overdose on drugs. Naloxone is a drug that is administered to alleviate that. But what is interesting about that situation is that often, while it can be administered in a hospital or in a medical situation, often it's administered in non-medical situations. So if you go to a bar, if you go to a club, if you go to a fraternity house, they will have naloxone kits. Universities will. What that often means then is the person who is then injecting that has no medical training, is not a doctor, is not a healthcare practitioner. And so once again, that seems to me one of the most stressful, craziest times of your life. And Gillian is the person who then designs the information, the instructions on how to do that. And what's great about that is she's also really embedded that into our design programs here. So our students have worked on the refinement of the instructions that are included in those naloxone kits, that thousands and thousands of those have been distributed and used. And the third part of that is Michelle Knox's work. She was a graduate student here. And she does work around what's called MAID here medically for people who are looking for ethical choice in ending their own life. If they, let's say, have terminal diseases, if they know that they would be much more at peace in making those choices. And so this was a study looking at locations of dying for people. So she did an ethnographic research based in both a hospice within the province of Alberta, as well as a hospice center inside of a university, and basically looked at the physical architecture in those spaces and the systems and processes in the spaces, and then guidelines on what actually makes, as she says, and this is to paraphrase very poorly, she talks about the amount of time that is spent on designing spaces for living, for us to enjoy, for us to really maximize our living space, that there's a dearth of research on what is the space of where we die? What does that look like? What does a good death look like within there? And she's continued that work into now doing her PhD, looking more at the systems of how MAID are applied within the province through there. But yeah, that article pulled those three things together and kind of pulled us together as a means of sort of cementing a lot of those design and health interactions and intersections there.
Yeah, it was very interesting. I, even reading the article myself, I thought, even though you mentioned three things, each one of those things could be considered a wicked problem, where they're just so large, like education and training, especially with doctors and palliative care. So, and now you've done ED, so they're all quite large problems. Do you think when you started on that journey that you understood exactly how big all those problems could be? Like ED in itself is huge. Or do you think there was a little bit of underestimation on such a big problem? Because with design thinking, my understanding is you want to say one problem, what is that real problem, redefining that problem to find out exactly how you can create some solutions for that.
I'm sure there is an underestimation of the complexity and the reach of those things, partly because I don't one fully understood sort of like, oh, this is going to be a challenge, or it's just so daunting. And as I would say to almost any student, you can spend your life on any one of those things and still have lots to go from there. The section that I talked about there, one of the nice things and one of the reasons why I wanted to be at a research intensive university was that access to different people, different ideas, different opportunities. And it was just a conversation, I'm sure. It's finding the right people that allow those linkages of like, oh, what if we did this? That, to be honest, to be selfish, I want to do interesting, impactful, important things. I mean, important with a small I maybe, right? But I mean, you've only got so much time and energy. How can you invest them in good ways? Yet at the same time, I'm also interested in, let's make this interesting and let's work from there. And so mine actually really just grew out of that opportunity. What if we took 20 design students and we took 20 healthcare students or whatever they were, and we got them to work in teams and push them out, so they had to kind of partner up with community groups and broader healthcare things, and who knows what'll come up. Let's see what comes up. And so often, at least for me, it's sort of happened that way. There's not this great plan, but this opportunity comes and then it builds on there and builds on there, and then a great grad student or these things. So in one way, yes, all of a sudden pulling together a paper like that, it looks like, oh, this is all thought through and planned, and oh, this feeds into that and that. And I'm sure there's a bit of that, but it's pretty behind the scenes, and it's not, at least from my point, maybe not for my colleagues, but yeah, you see a great opportunity and you grab it, and yeah, that's often what's happening.
Yeah, I always say with our design thinking, again, I love the actual process. I love the actual not knowing what the answer is. The answer is actually the easy part at the end. It's literally almost a checklist. Like, we can do this if we've got this much money. But getting to that problem is actually the real magic. And that problem solving is something that I think we can improve on, because there's not as many people focusing on healthcare as a wicked problem, and through design thinking it's very much still solution based answers as opposed to understanding what the problem is, because so many people have been in the industry for so long, they think they understand the problem and they're pretty bloody close. But I think the benefit of having someone who doesn't understand the problem, doesn't understand the industry, coming in with independent eyes and eager eyes of students, that actually does create a level of complexity that a lot of people hadn't seen before.
Yeah, I would like to think that's one of those opportunities, right? Of coming in and asking stupid questions, asking those things. And I think, to be honest, much of my educational approach is around that in many ways. Often as I mentioned, I think earlier, I do a lot of work with students, taking them to other locations or taking them, and that might even just be local. Much of our ethos here is really getting out of the studio space. We have beautiful design studios and students can work in there. But to be honest, and this is one of my critiques often of design education, is often it's built around, as I would say, sort of diluted ideas of what a design brief would be done in a studio setting, set between 3 hours with my requirements at the end. And in a weird way, I'm kind of judge, jury, and executioner. And that's actually really, at least for me, it's actually really easy, right? Like I know, okay, here's the brief we're going to do. We're going to work on this. And I'm pretty sure I'm going to get 20 responses that look all like this. But just as you said, there's a pretty big frisson of excitement. And if we go outside and I'm like, actually, we're going to work with this community group on this issue. And I don't really know how this is going to go. I know we're going to do something great out of it. I know we're going to get to a point where we're feeling pretty good and we're going to satisfy our learning requirements. But a certain amount of that is, as you said, like when we're starting this, I don't know if it's a design system or a great successful design process. If I'm going in day one and I don't know what it's going to look like on the last day, like whatever that thing is, unless I'm really awesome or unless I'm not really doing much, versus that idea of, okay, like let's really work on trying to understand the situation, the relationships, the problem, with all the participants involved. And then we could start to see where this is going to go. And I'm going to trust that system. And for good or bad, trust enough of my experience or one's experience, we're going to get somewhere. And that's a lot more complicated, but it's a lot more exciting. It's a lot more real. It's a lot more impactful, I think, than just prepackaged kind of learning opportunities through there.
Yeah, I totally agree. Now, I look forward to your new article coming out, but is there any more research coming out from the University of Alberta in reference to health, or what do you think your next big problem you are set to try and solve?
Well, maybe two things. My colleagues from the one paper that you had referenced within there, the Rethinking Health Through Design, we launched the Design Health Research Innovation Lab earlier this year. And that is meant to be a location and we're just building that up right now for everything from those publications to projects that we've worked on through there. So that's kind of ticking off this year. And the systematic review that I talked about that looked at the emergency room and the relation with design that was co-written with Michelle Knox, that was really meant to be the basis for a larger research grant that is actually going to, hopefully, I mean, we'll apply for the funding to actually now then do some real research within emergency departments here within the province of Alberta in a variety of locations. So Edmonton, Calgary, and some more rural places, to assess those and then also look at how we might actually look at implementing design to address issues within there. And more importantly, to try and do that obviously in the individual space, but also in a real way of hopefully looking at establishing some guidelines of how we might look at applying that at numerous other locations. So using that work as the baseline for a large research application later this year, and further collaborating with different emergency departments locally. We have a hospital here at the university, but also then throughout the province as well.
Yeah, no, that will keep you very, very busy.
Yes.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Wonderful. Thank you for the time. Thank you for the interest in the conversation.
Cool. Thank you for your time, Associate Professor Aidan Rowe. You have been listening to the Australian Health Design Council podcast series, Health Design on the Go. If you would like to learn more about the AHDC, please connect with us on our website or LinkedIn. Thank you for listening.